Hi, I'm Ken Fisher. Welcome to the 17th season of CityWide. All year, we're talking about the big issues impacting the lives of New Yorkers. Our subject is the impact of Hurricane Sandy, and my guest on this edition of CityWide is Marilyn Gelber, president of the Brooklyn Community Foundation, also a former commissioner of environmental protection of the City of New York. Marilyn, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, Ken.
We're going to talk about the Brooklyn Community Foundation and the work that you do on an everyday basis in just a minute, but more recently, you've been very involved with assessing the impact and coming up with strategies for dealing with the impact of Hurricane Sandy. So can you tell us, what have you seen, what's going on in Brooklyn, and what are you doing about it?
Well, Brooklyn's coastal communities really got hammered during this storm. The Brooklyn Community Foundation is somewhat unique in New York City. We're the only borough with its own foundation focused on doing good in Brooklyn. And so naturally, right after the storm, we began to make phone calls. We began to go out and see what had happened in the neighborhoods that we work in. And the foundation really has focused on a lot of issues of community development, on poverty, on education. And so our network of nonprofit partners is pretty deep. We began to understand the depth of this crisis in talking to people, particularly in public housing communities. The thing about Brooklyn is it's big, as you know, and the coastal communities have high-density public housing. Many of them do. And so Coney Island, Sheepshead Bay, Brighton, Red Hook, even Gowanus, these are places with high density of public housing, and these are the communities that particularly were damaged during this storm. We understood that this was going to be a complex and potentially long recovery. And what could we do about it? Well, as you said in the intro, I used to be in government. I used to be in a place where there were emergency response plans. You hopped to it, you got out there. We run a philanthropy, so what can we do? Well, what we immediately did was reach out both to the business community and to the public sector, to the borough president, to the Chamber of Commerce in Brooklyn, and immediately said we have to set up a fund, a recovery fund. And so the Brooklyn Recovery Fund was born. It took barely 2 days to begin the outreach to potential partners. And within days, we've raised nearly $1 million, both from large donors as well as the general public. More than 600 people have already contributed to this fund.
What's the money going to be used for?
The money is going to be used in 2 ways. One, for immediate emergency relief. You have a lot of players out there like the Red Cross and FEMA. Our network of local nonprofits are doing non-governmental work, but the kind of work that's necessary to keep communities together, and whether that's serving meals, going through public housing or other kinds of high-rise developments to honestly assess people's conditions. I got a call the other night, 10 o'clock at night, from somebody who is very concerned about hundreds of seniors who had stayed in their place in Coney Island, and there was no systematic survey of what their conditions were, what their needs were.
The Housing Authority hadn't done that? The city hadn't done that?
This actually was private housing. It was not NYCHA housing. Again, a community like Coney Island, which is very high density, has a mixture of public and privately held housing. You know, the work of the Recovery Fund will be to help the nonprofit community organize itself to respond right now, but also to knit itself together for the future. One of the things that we're promoting now is really a coalition of neighborhood organizations, both those that serve human service needs and those that are more interested in economic recovery. Well, what we're saying is, guys, work together. You know, it'll make for a stronger recovery now, but also a stronger community in the future.
How bad is it in Coney Island or Red Hook right now?
Well, the two communities are a little different. You know, Red Hook is isolated but relatively small. And there has been a network of nonprofits who were more prepared to respond. And I don't want to say it's good, it's not good, but at least on the human service side of things, there are improvements. People are taking care of each other. There is the door-to-door survey that's gone on for people. At the same time, the business community, the small stores along Van Brunt Street, again, they've begun to organize themselves, and even adjoining communities, largely because Red Hook, you know, is near Brownstone, Brooklyn. So here you have the restaurants on Smith Street reaching out to help the restaurants in Red Hook. So there's, you know, there's really a sense of cohesion and progress building there. I'd say Coney Island is more difficult. It's larger, it's more complex. You know, as I said, you have a mixture of public housing, private housing, senior housing. The players haven't quite come together in the same way. So we're seeing some real difficulties there, building the kind of coalition necessary to get through this.
I was struck a moment ago by your use of the phrase coastal communities. Just a few weeks ago, if we were having a conversation about the same neighborhoods, we would be talking about them as waterfront neighborhoods. And I'm wondering, in that subtle distinction, whether it signifies something significant about the perspective that we're going to have on neighborhoods from Williamsburg to Sheepshead Bay that's different because of the effects of the storm.
Well, I'm glad you picked that up because it's purposeful. In creating the Recovery Fund, we've talked about the coastal communities because we are a coastal borough. I mean, this is a city surrounded by water. I do think it's really important that, you know, it's not a waterfront, it's not a waterfront city that's only open for development. There are climate and environmental changes that we have to be aware of. You know, when Brooklyn made its decision to join in New York City in the consolidation, one of the main reasons was water. You know, Brooklyn had had its own water system, but joined with the larger system that the big new consolidated New York City was creating. And the reason I bring it up in this context, because the water table in Brooklyn has been rising steadily for many, many years. And again, at our peril, we ignore the environmental issues that a place like Brooklyn faces. The water table's up, and now with this kind of coastal surge, we need to understand as we rebuild now and think about what kind of city we want to be in the future, that we are coastal, and we should look at ourselves that way.
Do you think that this slows Brooklyn's momentum? I think that it's fair to say that the last 10 years have been Brooklyn's moment in a way that it hadn't been Brooklyn's moment since the 50s. And that the culmination of it, you can put aside how it got there or itself, but the opening of the Barclays Center, sort of on a symbolic level, sort of was the peak. You know, New York Magazine or the New Yorker, you know, Brooklyn is finished. It's the place everybody wants to be. Does this change that? Is Brooklyn now at a plateau?
First, let me give a little credit. Barclays and the new Brooklyn Nets were the first to step up to make big contributions towards the Recovery Fund. They got it right away. No, I don't think that this is a sign that Brooklyn has plateaued, that the future is any more dim than you know it needs to be. I think Brooklyn is maturing, and it's maybe at a reflective moment. I think in many ways, this recovery fund, the storm has brought out the vulnerabilities, but it's also bringing out the strengths. And I think ultimately the strength of Brooklyn isn't the strength of go-go real estate. It's the strength of the communities we build. And I think this is a moment where looking how we react in a crisis, how we organize ourselves to respond to that, that's going to build even greater strength in Brooklyn. Again, on the merchant side, on the human service side, what we're seeing now are people coming together in a way, and that's the strength of Brooklyn. Yes, I think it may change certain development options. I think people will think a little differently on how they make the investments, but I think in many ways the rapid pace of change in Brooklyn, maybe there'll be a little pause in it, but in fact, I think Brooklyn is totally on the upswing and will continue to do so, to be that way. However, you know, we've talked a lot about the tale of two Brooklyns. I mean, Forbes just did a story, New York Magazine did a story. It's something that the foundation has looked at really seriously because we use data in the work that we do.
I was going to ask you about that. Before we go to the second half, I just wanted to, your insights are the result of more than a decade of doing nothing but thinking about the future of Brooklyn and what its needs are. Could you just tell us briefly a little bit about the work of the foundation?
Sure. Well, it's thinking and action. The foundation for now 14 years has been doing grant making in Brooklyn. Having come from government, I have to say I perhaps underestimated the importance, the relevance of the nonprofit community, because for the last 14 years, I've seen things from the direction of the community up. For 14 years, we've looked at Brooklyn neighborhoods, we've invested in Brooklyn neighborhoods. In particular, the issues of poverty in Brooklyn, the extremes in Brooklyn, again, the tale of two Brooklyns, they're very real. I mean, Brooklyn has more poor people than the city of Detroit. It also has more wealthy people than Greenwich, Connecticut. We're big. It's the numbers, it's the magnitude. And I think, again, back to your question about the future, I think this is a moment to look at poverty, to look at strength, and to knit people together. I think the worst thing in the world is this kind of a two-city in one place, that there's the prosperous Brooklyn and the poor Brooklyn. No, what we're trying to do through the work of the foundation, through the investment in nonprofits, through the investment in certain neighborhoods, is make sure everybody has the opportunity to succeed.
We're going to talk a little bit more about what those needs and opportunities are when CityWide continues right after this.
Hi, I'm Matthew Goldstein. November is CUNY month and a great time to visit CUNY campuses in all 5 boroughs. Learn why more CUNY students than ever are winning national awards and scholarships. Our colleges and professional schools are holding open houses for you. Meet world-class faculty. Ask about financial aid. The time to start working on your future is now. Visit cuny.edu/CUNY month.
Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with Marilyn Gelber, president of the Brooklyn Community Foundation. We were talking before the break about the two Brooklyns, the extreme poverty, wealth, the magnitude, the diversity of the population. And I want to ask you something about the nature of philanthropy in Brooklyn. It seems to me that there is a difference, a generational difference, if you will, between immigrants of my parents' and my grandparents' generation and immigrants today who are much more closely associated with the countries from which they came. When my grandparents left Eastern Europe, they had no expectation or, quite frankly, any interest in going back. But we know many people who are routinely going back and forth between the Dominican Republic or the Caribbean or many other places. And to some extent, not only are they not yet at the point of accumulating enough wealth to be significant donors, but their interests are in rebuilding Haiti or in the charitable activities that most directly affect their community. So am I right in my assessment, and does that make it difficult for Brooklyn-wide institutions, the Brooklyn Children's Museum or others, to sustain themselves through significant philanthropy?
I would disagree on some level with what you've said. Yes, Brooklyn has always been home to people from all over the world, who are seeking freedom, economic opportunity. It's truer now than in many ways it's ever been. What the Community Foundation does, it's a vehicle that encourages local giving. And again, we say you don't have to be a millionaire or a billionaire to be a philanthropist in Brooklyn. Let me just go back a little. We set this up because while New York City is like the philanthropy capital of the world, when there was a study done a few years ago by the Foundation Center, literally they found that 89.7%, I'd like to forget that number, but I can't, 89%, nearly 90% of all the grants made in New York City went to Manhattan-based organizations,
Wow.
which, again, Manhattan-based organizations can do fine work in Brooklyn. I'm not saying they don't. But integral to our philosophy is that you build strength locally by building strength locally and investing locally. So what we do as a foundation isn't only go after, the good and the great and the wealthiest people in Brooklyn. What we've done is create a foundation of pooled resources where anyone can give and you can make a difference. So particularly in immigrant communities where there's a very vibrant new nonprofit community, those organizations, yes, we can seed them, and some of them, we seed them with startup grants. They can get started with our help, but before too long, then we encourage them, we challenge them to raise more money amongst their own community to be able to support this work. We're not government. We don't expect nonprofits to be supplicants to us. What we're trying to do is build a new culture of giving, more self-sufficiency. I mean, that's what it's about. So is it hard? Yes, it is hard. Brooklyn is tribal in its own way. On the other hand, it's also a very generous place. We recently did an analysis of community board by community board, where, per capita, who are the most generous community board areas. They tend to be in some of the areas that have large immigrant populations. So again, I think what we've done is provide a mechanism that allows people to give, to see how they can make a difference, even with small giving.
If somebody wants to make a contribution right now to the Relief Fund or to get more information about how they can make a difference, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, one way is go to our website, brooklyncommunityfoundation.org. In that, you'll find coming right up on the front page is the Brooklyn Recovery Fund. Take a look at that, give. We've also recently made it possible to text to the Recovery Fund, so you can do that as well. I don't know if I should read off the text numbers, but certainly you can text to the fund, you can give online, you can write a check, but the important thing is to find a way you can contribute. Because the other thing I would say is, in light of the fact that Brooklyn is not the wealthiest place in the world, we also created a way for people to give back through service. So we created a part of our website that has to do with you being able to see where there are volunteer opportunities for you in Brooklyn, where you can serve, where you could give back without writing a check. So again, go to the website, brooklyncommunityfoundation.org, and you'll see the opportunities to give and serve in the borough.
You have served in government in a variety of capacities, including having been the executive assistant to the borough president of Brooklyn. And I think if history is fair, it is always, and we look back, a lot of credit for Brooklyn's current success has to be given to Howard Golden for having staunched the bleeding, if you will, during the really bad years, the crime and economic recession years in the 70s and 80s, by investing city funds in Brooklyn's cultural institutions. He was way ahead of anybody else in the notion that if people were attracted to a place, the jobs would follow. Metrotech and some of the other things that flowed from it. And I think we also have to give Marty Markowitz credit that at a time when Brooklyn needed a cheerleader, he was the perfect person to do that. and to shout from the rooftops that Brooklyn was the place where everything was happening, and a lot of people have come into the borough and brought new energy as a result of that. The Barclay Center, basically his idea, and I think there's, that's not just urban legend. He's going to be leaving as a result of term limits. What does Brooklyn need in the next borough president? Not the who or the politics, but what are the characteristics of the person that that should be following for the next chapter of Brooklyn?
I think it's a little bit of the combination of the two personalities. I want my next borough president to be a serious, thoughtful person who understands government, who understands how to use the powers in government to create opportunity. I also, would love to see somebody who has the kind of whimsy, the kind of humor, because Brooklyn is both serious, it's street and cerebral. And I hope that the next borough president will be thoughtful, particularly now faced with what's going to be a long rebuilding. The issues around planning and development are pretty key here. And the issues around how do you involve communities in figuring out the future. That's something that we look at through the foundation too, which is why we created at Brooklyn College, we actually created the Center for the Study of Brooklyn to do this kind of neighborhood-based research to build a platform upon which the next borough president, the next set of elected officials can make some decisions based on facts. I believe in fact-based philanthropy, and I think in terms of public policy, it's really important to have data that can help inform your decisions. So I think the next borough president, I want a smart person. I want somebody who's smart and serious, thoughtful on planning and development issues, but also understands the need to for the humor and the whimsy that Marty's brought to the office.
Does Brooklyn get its fair share?
Well, it's hard to answer that question without immediately saying, no, it doesn't. But the fact is, Brooklyn is big. Again, it's the size, think about it, Brooklyn's the size of Atlanta, Boston, San Francisco combined. We're a huge city with what I call government light. Without the means to control your budget, the money in, the money out, it's a difficult kind of situation. In terms of fair share, no, I don't think Brooklyn should be a supplicant to Manhattan. I mean, that's been the tradition, and certainly in the 80s and the bad old days, when I worked for Harry Golden, we were always knocking on the door at city planning, at City Hall, to say, Brooklyn's not getting its fair share. I don't know what that means anymore. I think the equity of decision-making is hard in the current governmental system we have. We're a very executive city now. The borough president's lost enormous powers after the last charter change. So I think the trick is, how do you use what you have in a smart way to leverage the private sector interest, the philanthropic interest, and to align that with the public sector. I think it's a trickier business now than it used to be. So I don't know about fair share particularly. I think we have a unique challenge because of our size and complexity. If we were our own city, we might do things differently, but we're not. So how do you work within the system you have?
So with term limits, with the turnover in government, with a new mayor coming in, with the new borough president, if there was one message that you wanted to share with Brooklyn residents today about what they should be asking candidates when they come to them for their votes in the municipal elections in 2013, what is it that Brooklyn residents should be asking their representatives for? What does Brooklyn need for the next term?
Respect. I think Brooklyn, you want your elected officials to really have an understanding of what it means to respect the community, what it means to respect the local powers to accomplish change and growth. I think what you want in your candidates is the ability to listen. And maybe that's part of respect. But you want communication, you want somebody who listens, and you want somebody who will really respond to you and answer questions in again, a thoughtful way. I think that, you know, there are so many pressures on elected officials, particularly in a system where there are pressures from City Hall as well as local pressures. What you want somebody is who's knowledgeable and can achieve a balance. I mean, we haven't talked issues, but education is critical to the future of Brooklyn. It's critical to all the, you know, the wealthier parts of Brooklyn, the parts of Brooklyn that don't have as much. So I want the next level of leaders in Brooklyn to really be knowledgeable about education and understand how to, again, we're part of this bigger system of million children system. How do you do things on a local level that are aligned with citywide policies, but also really meet the needs of a community? Tricky stuff.
My thanks to Marilyn Gelber, president of the Brooklyn Community Foundation. I'm Ken Fisher. Thanks for joining us on this edition of CityWide. Send your comments and suggestions to CityWide at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or contact us at cuny.tv.